The d5 chain, I like this from the King's Indian. So white's often playing for c5, black's often playing for f5, f4. If the king's over here, the king's also a target, not just a pawn chain strategy. So things for white, massive queenside space advantage, c4, c5. Obviously prepared with b4, b4. Prophylaxis with g4, just to try and stop black playing f5 or slow it down. The f4 break, sometimes that's a bad idea, especially if finish out a bishop. That gives black, the e5 square for either a knight, or just extends the scope of the bishop. So often that's not great to play for f4, I'd say. It depends on the position, of course. So the pawns are the soul of chess, according to Philidor. So we're just really exploring that. A c6 break is also possible in this structure. I guess because there's no g6, this is slightly more versatile for black to play for like c6 and just try and get c-file pressure. The e5 chain. So this can often occur from the French defence, So white's playing for like a mating attack with f4, f5, yes. Feeds for black, c5, yes. This is the exploitable base of the chain. f6 is also the front of the chain, undermining at the front. I would say, black has to be more careful sometimes for his king's safety, because the knight's been driven from f6, that key defensive knight. The King's Indian Ragozin formation. Now this is tricky. I think black here is often okay because the c5 square is often able to be used. And black hasn't got the problem of d5, but white has got a d4 problem. So black can often get a big knight on d4. So things for white, d6 weakness, the c5 push, the a3 to f8 diagonal, the queenside pawn storm. Things for black, the d4 weakness, yes, because the pawn's not on c3. The a1 to h8 diagonal, the f4 square. So the Ragozin formation is named after Ragozin, who apparently introduced it in the Roy Lopez. But it also can occur from queen's pawn openings, of course. It's considered to give black excellent chances because d6 is much less of a hold than white's d4. Yes, that's what I think, because there's no d5 issue. So I think that is an interesting structure for black to aim for. The King's Indian, the Boleslavsky wall. So d6 is seemingly presented as an exploitable weakness on the semi-open file. So things like d6 weakness, e4, e5 and c5 breaks. Minority attack with b4, b5. Yeah, that would isolate, well, at least the a pawn. But not, it would still black would have some islands. Themes for black, attacking the e4 and c4 pawns. Yeah, because there's a semi-open file there. c4, sometimes I suppose you can have a bishop there to attack that, but in terms of rooks, the e4 pawn is going to be more exposed. The Queen's Gambit Isolani. So yeah, this isolated pawn, playing with the isolated pawn, you get a nice outpost square. You get rooks which can infiltrate like via e3 or c3 here, because there's no pawn on c2 or e2. So there's big chances for kingside attacks. The downside, of course, the endgames being blockaded, light squares generally being weak, d5, e4, c4. So it's play revolving around d5 square. If black can clamp down on the pawn, then the positional trumps and the threat of exchanges give the advantage. If not, the threat of d5 break is ever present, and the Isolani can sometimes be sacrificed to unleash the potential of white's pieces, enabling them to whip up a whirlwind attack. So yeah, d5 is critical sometimes, because then that kind of unleashes like this diagonal, and rooks can come in and knights can come in d4 and horrible things can happen to black. So it's double-edged, the isolated pawn. Nimzovich has talked about the isolated pawn at length. So there's different examples here. So knight b5 got the isolated pawn for black. Black obtained a devastating attack with d4 here, Makarov, Kasparov. So it shows the upsides and downsides. The hanging pawns, yeah, so these are sometimes a bit weak. They can't protect each other, and if they move, then there's a blockade square. So say c5, d5 becomes easy to blockade for black. So things for black, forcing a pawn advance and blockading the pair. Conversion to Isolani. So I guess if you can convert it to an isolated queen pawn, that would be good, or an isolated c pawn, that would be also good. You'll have nice blockade squares. So like the Arsenalini, the hanging pawns is a structural weakness and must not be entered into unless the piece position offers some compensation. So you wouldn't enter into this lightly unless you had some chances for a kingside attack or something like that. You need dynamic piece play. If black can establish a permanent blockade, the game is positionally won. On the other hand, white aims to keep the pawns hanging, trying to generate kingside attack and leveraging off their superior central control. Other things include tactical possibilities and line breaks, opening breaks in the centre. I also think there's a potential for passed pawns here. I think Kasparov has demonstrated that in a few times. The Queen's Gambit orthodox exchange. So here, I mean, this is b4, b5 is a classic plan to fracture black's pawn structure. c5 is a nice outpost usually. So things for white, minority attack. So e4 is also a liberating move. Didn't work out in my recent game against Chen. It just needs to have pressure behind it. Things like the e4 post, especially that big semi-open file. So having a nice e4 post can support a big attack on the white's king later if white's not careful. The Panov formation. So here, semi-open dynamic game, yes, okay. Themes for white. Well, there's potential for b4, b5 and c6. So it's like Panov Botvinnik attack in the Slav defence. So, and also if white can maintain the grip on the dark squares and stop black liberating later with e5, I think that's pretty cool as well. So themes for white, exploiting the dark squares, queenside majority in endgame, yeah, with an advanced pawn. Themes for black, e4 post, liberating with e5, yes, and b5 breaks, b7 to b5. Not sure about that one. How does that work? White's overextended pawn. Oh, alright. Okay. So exploiting, if white had a pawn on b5, then e5 would be exploiting, I suppose, that. Okay. The Stonewall formation, there's gagging knight outposts for both sides here on e4 and e5. Exchanging the bad bishops, yeah, so getting rid of the bad bishop on c8 or white's one on c1. So you have good pieces around this structure. Very committal for the pawn structure here. So players must carefully consider how to recapture on e4, e5, since it alters the symmetrical pawn formation and creates strategic subtleties. So it also appears in Botvinnik's treatments of the English, adding a typical white's fianchetto, the king's bishop. So on g2 usually, yeah. So structure provides significant pressure on the long diagonal, this diagonal, and usually prepares f2, f4, f5 later. Okay, but in this symmetrical situation, I think often, if once I can get the attack with rook f3 to h3 or queen h5, then that's usually the winner, or if black does it. But yeah, the question of this bishop also, these bishops can be manoeuvred like this to h4 or h5, or maybe on this diagonal as well, or this diagonal. So those are things to do with pieces, I think. The closed Sicilian formation. I don't usually go into this. Maybe I should try it out. So kingside pawn storm for white. c3 and d4 later. So you get a nice structure in the centre. Things for that queenside pawn storm, you have like b5, a5, b4 stuff. This diagonal. So that's interesting. So if we understand our slowest bottleneck, which is the pawn structure, and the pawns cannot go backwards, they often dictate the nature of the game. Pawns are the soul of chess, is something Philidor once said. Please leave any comments or questions on YouTube, and feel free to have a look at this. It's on Wiki. If you look up Wiki pawn structure on Google. Thanks very much.